Okay, just on behalf of the Water and Environment Society, just to get things started, if you just all remember to knock off your phones, and if there's a fire alarm or anything, there's the exit that you came in up above, and there's a door down below here. So just to introduce John Paul Rooney from Rowan O'Donovan. John Paul's an associate with ROD in the site development side of the team, and he has a particular interest in SuDS, and he's going to give us a synopsis of some research that he did into the barriers against SuDS and solutions to those barriers in the Dublin region. So, JP.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming in this evening. I suppose, as Owen introduced me there, I'm a civil engineer with Rowan and O'Donovan Consulting Engineers, and I've been working, I suppose, in the area of SuDS and drainage since around 2006, shortly after the GDSDS, the Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study, was published, and I suppose, following on from my work in Rowan and O'Donovan and my own experience of working for public and private sector clients on a wide range of developments and development types. One of the things, I suppose, that struck me and particularly interested me was why we don't see more SuDS sites and SuDS features in Ireland. So that led me to undertake a research master's degree in Trinity College, supported by ROD, I'm happy to say, to examine what what are the drivers of SuDS and what is driving the SuDS agenda in Ireland. Now, this study focuses on the Dublin region, I suppose, because Dublin is the economic engine of the country, and the GDSDS that was published by the Dublin local authorities, essentially, but has been adopted, and the principles of the GDSDS have been adopted by all of the local authorities. So shortly after the GDSDS was published, it was adopted by the local authorities in terms of planning policy, and there's various objectives in county development plans and local area plans supporting SuDS. So the studies that have been done in this area in Ireland have really focused on the technical barriers or perceived technical difficulties with SuDS. So when I started out on this journey, on this study, I was expecting to find that the perception in Ireland would be the case that it's really technical difficulties that we're trying to overcome. But in fact, really what I discovered was that it's more to do with leadership and the challenges faced by the civil engineer in society, and really it's one of governance is probably how the issue can be described. So I'll give a brief overview at the start, just in terms of what SuDS is and what our perception of SuDS is. Some examples of some SuDS features that we should probably see more of, and then I'll go into some detail in relation to what the barriers actually appear to be in Ireland. So as part of this study, I suppose I drew on my own experiences in this area from working for a wide range of clients, and I looked at about 40 academic papers that were published and peer-reviewed and published in countries where SuDS is established practice for about the past 20 years. So we looked at success factors in Australia, in the United States, of Europe, and in the UK. and compared those drivers and success factors to the Irish situation. And I suppose with the advent of Irish water recently, that has thrown up what could perceive to be potential challenges, but also solutions to the implementation of SuDS. So whenever you start off an academic study, you usually write your introduction and your conclusions before you do anything, and then you spend the next 2 years changing your introduction and conclusions right up to an hour before the thing is due in. But here's my findings of the study anyway. So just looking at what is SuDS. Now I'm not going to go into this in detail because I think many of you here have an understanding of what SuDS and sustainable drainage systems is, but really in terms of the definition of SuDS across the globe, the definition or the understanding of SuDS, I suppose there isn't really an accepted definition of SuDS. It really depends. I suppose the definition correlates the extent to which it has been established in policy and legislation over the last 10 to 15 years. So in Ireland, and I suppose to an extent in the UK, our understanding of SuDS really is that it's a flood risk management tool, and it provides obviously some treatment of surface water discharge, and there are, I suppose, biodiversity benefits as well. But internationally, when you look at places like Australia and in parts of the United States, where it's really been embedded in policy and legislation for the past 20 years, the benefits of SuDS are really more focused on social and ecological benefits. It's recognised and accepted as providing an alternative source of water supply, and it economic growth and regeneration and development, particularly in urban areas. So we've got, I suppose we probably haven't grasped that opportunity that SuDS presents for a wide range of reasons, and I'll touch on those later on. But essentially, if we look at what is SuDS, in essence, the essence of SuDS is that it's drainage that mimics nature. So if we think about the hydrological cycle and what happens to water after it rains, so we get some ponding, we get some infiltration, we get groundwater recharge, we get evaporation and evapotranspiration. So SuDS and SuDS measures and SuDS features should do all of those things. But really at the heart of SuDS is the management train approach. So we have source control, site control, and regional control throughout a catchment. So it's been accepted that for SuDS to be effective, limiting it only to new developments is in itself a barrier. So SuDS needs to be implemented systematically throughout a catchment. So we get source control within the footprint of or within a couple of meters of buildings. We have our site controls, which can be ponds or other attenuation devices that provide SuDS, and regional controls, where at points downstream in the network, like for example what they're doing in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, they're mobilising publics to provide space for ponds. But for SuDS to be effective, it needs to be systematically implemented throughout a catchment, which means you need consistent policies. So traditional local authority boundaries shouldn't really come into it, and local rules and regulations and practices shouldn't really come into it, because there should be a consistency throughout river catchments. So I suppose that brings us on to the GDSDS, and there are a whole range of reports that were published as part of the Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study back in 2005. But I suppose the ones of particular interest are Volume 2, which is Policy for New Developments, and Volume 3, Environmental Management, which goes in some detail into the types of SuDS features that can be designed, how to design them, and the benefits that they bring. But given that SuDS policy has been really implemented since 2005, I suppose it begs the question as well, where is the evidence of SuDS? If you look around you, if we walk through Dublin city centre, you'd be hard pressed to find SuDS features, let alone evidence of a management train. So the fact that SuDS policy was accepted and adopted by the local authority in development plans is a good thing. It also raises the question, well, is that enough? And in terms of SuDS and stormwater practice in general, what the GDSDS does is it provides quantitative discharge limits for surface water outfalls. So it's quite prescriptive in terms of the level of surface water attenuation that need to be provided. And it gives a menu of SuDS options that can be adopted by the private citizen or the private developer in terms of new developments. But it also throws up, I suppose, further issues in that within the GDSDS itself, it describes what or the different types of SuDS features that can be accepted and that are accepted by the local authority for taking in charge. And there are differences across local authorities. And when you're dealing on a large scheme, for example, it could be a road scheme or a motorway scheme, where you're crossing more than one local authority boundary, you find that different rules apply between local authorities. So there's a number of issues that are thrown up in terms of our current driver or the drivers of SuDS in Ireland. I suppose in terms of SuDS, it's worth pointing out that there are various, the challenge with SuDS is that it's not as simple as designing your traditional drainage systems. So the old rules where you would be designing pipes using the modified rational method and the Wallingford procedure, fairly straightforward. But with SuDS, there's a whole range of other factors that have to be taken into account, such as maintenance regimes, site characteristics, ground conditions, and probably the key one is community acceptance. Is the public aware of the need for SuDS and the benefits that it can bring? We'll touch on that later on. So really, if we bring it back to fundamentals in terms of what is sustainability, I suppose that the three pillars of sustainability in engineering are viability, function, and aesthetics. And you need those three elements for any development to be sustainable. So it needs to be viable so it needs to be financially viable. It needs to make sense financially. It has to be functional, so it has to be fit for purpose when the thing is built, and it has to have aesthetic merit, because if we build things that don't have aesthetic value, then we find that over time they tend to get demolished and something else gets built in its place, and that isn't necessarily, it certainly isn't acceptable. When I graduated from college back in 2002, I worked for 2 years with the civil engineering contractor, and my first job I worked on was a development called Misery Hill Car Park and Square down at Dublin's Docklands. It's now that very attractive plaza that was designed by Martha Schwartz. So when I was involved in that scheme, initially the plaza was constructed using reconstituted granite paving with some water features and some lights, and it looked quite attractive. But when the developers started to develop around that plaza, didn't like the look of it. It wasn't in keeping with what was going on around it, so it was subsequently, about a year later, it was demolished. And a new plaza was built in its place, simply because it didn't have aesthetic merit. So I think as engineers, we need to be mindful of the fact that we don't just leave these things to architects or planners, and particularly in SuDS. We have a role to play in that. And, you know, as we all, I think we heard from several contributors at the Engineers Ireland conference talking about the role of the civil engineer in society, and that engineers and civil engineers and structural engineers in particular, we don't tend to take a leadership role in these matters. It's the general public often have the view that the civil engineer or the engineer in general is there to serve big business and corporate clients, and that we don't get involved in public discourse as much as we should. And I think it's hard to argue with that. So that's, I suppose, leadership and governance, and that all feeds in with these three pillars of sustainability. So when we look at, I suppose I'll focus here on aesthetics, because in terms of viability and function, just looking at SuDS, it is now accepted internationally that SuDS is cheaper, essentially, than traditional drainage practices. It does work. There's enough evidence of SuDS features across the globe to back that up. So it seemed to me that it must be an issue of aesthetics. It must be that SuDS isn't attractive or doesn't add value. So I just briefly, just to show some examples of SuDS. I mean, this just looks like a bit of planting in front of a building, but that's a rain garden. So the runoff from the roof discharges into those planters before it goes into the public system. I think I think we'd all agree that that's attractive. Here we have some bioretention areas. When they're dry and when it rains, here's what they can do. They store storm water and treat it and deal with much of it before it can overflow to the surface water drainage system. Again, that's very attractive, and we're putting in some of these down in Dublin's Docklands at the moment as part of some developments down there. So I think we'd all agree that they're attractive and they're in urban environments. These photos are taken from the US in Portland. A nice swale. I'm not too keen on the curb. That shouldn't be there. But I think that is a nice feature at the edge of a road. Here we have a basin in an urban setting or a semi-urban setting, certainly adding value. Some of these photos actually come from the DMERS, the design manual for urban roads and streets, and they look like nice landscaped areas, but in fact they're SuDS features. So it's hard to imagine that aesthetics is an issue. So here we have some basins, again in the urban setting, and in suburban settings where they're used as public parks. Now this one, does that have aesthetic merit or doesn't it? This is Hopwood Park in the UK, but I would argue that it does, because what we see here is this nice wide filter strip is doing what it's supposed to do, in that it's trapping the hydrocarbons and dealing with it at source before it discharges into an infiltration trench, which ultimately discharges to the local river. So this is actually a large petrol station beside a very sensitive river, and it's helped to restore water quality. So, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder on this one. But the fact that all of the contaminants in the water is kept at the surface and it's visible is certainly a benefit. So if it's not viability, and if it's not function, and if it's not aesthetics, then what is it exactly? So it ticks all the boxes in terms of the pillars of civil engineering sustainability. So what's going on? Are we unique in Ireland? Are there particular constraints that we are yet to overcome? And what do they do abroad that we don't do? So as part of this study, we looked at, I examined 40 academic papers on this study, and then I conducted some interviews with local authority personnel and with some figures in Irish Water. And generally speaking, this is where I was surprised, internationally, the biggest issues in terms of implementing SuDS and SuDS come down to governance, legislation, and local authority capacity. And that was actually, to my surprise, it correlated exactly to the Irish experience that I was able to establish following structured interviews with and important figures in the local authorities and in Irish Water, who are all involved in designing and implementing SuDS systems. So just going through these one by one, just looking at governance. I suppose governance is all about openness, transparency and accountability. And this, I suppose this is something that is of particular interest to Irish Water at the moment. So there are certain characteristics that are successful internationally, where we've seen that by and large having a single organisation with responsibility for water in general, that is water supply, wastewater and stormwater, because they're all linked by the water anyway. But that needs to be supported by legislation at state level, at regional level and at local level. But the key to all of that is governance, in that people need to be incentivized, encouraged and informed as to what they need to be doing and why they need to be doing it. And I think that's really the critical thing, and I think that's where, as civil engineers, that's a real opportunity for us. Because one of the things that strikes me when I meet clients and I'm talking to them and advising them is that the general public trust engineers. So if we have an opinion on something, and when we're advising clients and when we're using our engineering judgment, they accept that, and with that comes a lot of responsibility. But we are all professionals and we have a leadership role, but as well as that, we are very accessible. We're more accessible than planners. It can be very difficult to get hold of a planner and try to establish what is the basis of the various decisions that are made. Architects, fairly accessible. They can be a little bit lofty from time to time. I won't say they're in their ivory tower all the time, but it can be difficult to engage, particularly for, I would say, the average person who isn't necessarily involved in the construction industry, and they would only come across architects if I suppose they would deem them as being a necessary evil, but they certainly have a very important role to play, naturally enough. But we are, I suppose, we are accessible and we are trusted, and it's really incumbent on us not just to give our clients what they want. And I think this is one of the key issues that was raised at the annual conference, is that really engineers we need to get more involved in making sure that the right policies are implemented and the right policies are put together in the first place. So governance is all about, as I've just touched on it, making sure that people are incentivized, encouraged and informed and given a voice and given power and have I suppose a role in the decision-making process. because that's fundamental to having legislation that's successful. And following on from that then is the local authority capacity, because it is the local authorities at local level that oversee the design and construction and implementation of these. So those are all linked very, very closely. So if we look at governance and the barriers under the governance heading, I would say that most people aren't actually aware that surface water runoff is pretty nasty and can be pretty harmful and can be very damaging to our rivers and our ecosystems. And if we actually had more control over our stormwater discharge, then there would be benefits in terms of our water supply infrastructure. We possibly wouldn't need to spend as much money treating the water, and we would be able to use it within communities. And again, that public awareness and leadership issue, that falls to us to a large degree. Lack of trust is a tough one, and it really follows on from the other one. But one of the things that really struck me during the interviews and working for some clients, I can understand it fully, is that local authorities don't necessarily trust private developers to do what they say they are going to do in the manner that they've described it as part of their planning application or compliance process. So, it's quite apparent in Ireland. We know we have an issue at local government level where local authorities are understaffed and are under-resourced, and we don't have the capabilities where local authorities can go around inspecting SuDS systems and drainage systems that they have been constructed as they have been described, or that they're even operating in the fashion that they were designed to operate, and that they're being maintained by the private citizen. So what we're actually seeing is that local authorities are now essentially insisting on the top of infrastructure. So where in some areas in Dublin where a developer wants to build quite a large development, the local authority are insisting that actually within the catchment or further downstream, possibly in some public parks or public open spaces, that the developer actually fund some works to be undertaken in those areas to provide some flood protection and flood mitigation and SuDS features, because they don't necessarily believe that the developer is going to do what they say they're going to do. But at the same time, the private citizen isn't necessarily being incentivized or encouraged to do the right thing. It can be a challenge that we all face as engineers, where a client will say, I want to get planning permission and I want to do minimum, so just tick the boxes. We need to move away from that. That isn't the way to go, and in the long run that'll cost us all. A key one actually, and again this was certainly a new finding for me, but a consistent theme across the local authorities was that the biggest issues they traditionally face isn't necessarily from private sector clients, because the private sector client will more or less sign up to almost anything so long as they get planning. The problem usually come after that. But the Part 8 process, and where we have large schemes of strategic or national importance where there's an EIS and it goes to oral hearing, those two scenarios are actually the biggest issues for the local authority implementing their own rules and policies. I suppose the fundamental thing about the Part 8 process is that in general, this is where the local authority essentially applies for planning permission for a local authority development. What often happens is that what does happen in the Part 8 process is that it's the elected representatives that set the planning conditions. So if a site is to be developed, a notice goes up and an advert is placed in the newspaper, and unless the general public have a particular view on a particular development, or have a particular interest in SuDS. And if flooding or if surface water drainage in general isn't raised as an issue in the planning process, then it can often be that there's, and I've seen this from my own experience, there can be a standard set of conditions, and drainage may or may not be an issue, or it may just be that attenuation is referenced, or it may mean that there's no reference to SuDS at all. And then the battle comes down to at the compliance stage that is addressed then. So it's a particular issue that's unique to the partake process. And the other one then is where we have an EIS and Board Planola are deciding on what the appropriate planning conditions should be. So if you imagine if you've got a long motorway that crosses maybe 2, 3 or 4 local authority boundaries, Board Planola will often say the drainage for this road shall be designed and constructed in accordance with the requirements of the local authority. But there might be 4 local authorities. So unless the design engineer is familiar with the requirements of the various local authorities and engages with the local authorities at feasibility study stage, you often find that what will happen is that there will be some ad hoc solution provided at an outfall to a stream or river, or an end of pipe solution, or it can lead to frustration and delay. So those are particular issues that are, I suppose, you would say almost unique to Ireland. And one issue that kept coming up, and my roads colleagues in Rowan and Donovan were getting very exercised about this, the Roads Act. You know, what under the Roads Act, and there's perfectly valid reasons for it, but if a private citizen wants to make a connection to a public surface water sewer, they need to get permission from the local authority to do that. But under the Roads Act, the local authority are perfectly entitled to resolve a flooding issue on a road, for example, in an urban area, but in 5 or 6 gullies, and connect it into the surface water drainage system, or do what needs to be done to resolve the flooding issue without considering SuDS. So there will often then be an issue, again consistently, this was apparent through all the local authorities, potential conflicts between the requirements of the drainage divisions and the roads departments. So existing legislation is actually proving to be a barrier in that case. So then, how do we overcome all of these? Well, really what we've seen and what we've found internationally is that it's really education and public awareness programs to encourage SuDS retrofit. That's the key one, and to garner support for new legislation. It isn't enough just to implement SuDS as part of new developments, and new developments only. There needs to be wider incentives. A very interesting study was undertaken in the UK, in Manchester, where they examined the planning policy wording in the local area plans of all the local authorities in Manchester. And they looked at the strength of the wording versus the implementation of SuDS. And what they found is that in certain local authorities where there was very, very strong policy wording, there was no correlation. That didn't correlate at all with the implementation of SuDS on the ground. So planning policy wording really had no correlation to SuDS. Really the success of SuDS implementation and SuDS retrofit was where the local authority had the resources and had the capacity to generate public interest and public support, and they came up with their own policies and initiatives. So one example would be, for example, what they did in the US in Portland was local scout groups were encouraged to knock on doors and to provide water butts for free. And for every water butt that they gave away, they got $2 from the local authority, and millions of cubic metres of water was removed from the combined sewer system. In parts of the UK, where there's particular environmental awareness programs, where green city initiatives were promoted, where it was recognised that providing sustainability huge economic benefits. Large swathes of public roads and public footpaths were greened, essentially, where there was local groups would go out planting trees, essentially, and putting in plants at the corners of streets. And because people were aware and are aware of those issues and aware of the issues associated with surface water discharge, it meant that when new legislation came in, which essentially means that in the UK they pay for surface water discharge, there are no people generally, by and large, have no problem paying for that. So for there to be, I suppose, a successful program or a successful legislative regime and successful governance, it really starts off with public awareness and education. One of the key drivers of SuDS back in 2005, when the Water Framework Directive was something that we've all had to sign up to, it was the discharge from combined sewer overflows is a particular issue, and SuDS was seen as being fundamental to that. So reducing the burden on combined sewer overflows is an issue and is being addressed now by Irish Water. That's in their remit. But of course, surface water drainage isn't. So from discussions with Irish Water, it's accepted that yes, SuDS is a good thing. But if it comes down, if there's a choice, and if we're just looking at a combined sewer overflow, and if it just comes down to the economics of that one issue, well then the choice is quite simple. It's either, do I provide additional capacity at my overflow, or do I provide a SuDS retrofit scheme or initiative where I will reduce the surface water discharge at source before it gets into my combined sewer? And generally speaking, by and large, it will be an awful lot cheaper to enlarge the combined sewer overflow capacity and not provide the SuDS retrofit scheme, if it's just being examined in a narrow perspective. But if we look at the wider benefits of SuDS and what it can do, and if the cost-benefit analysis was broadened to include the economic benefits associated with SuDS retrofit, then of course there would be, the SuDS retrofit scheme would be the obvious one to go with. But the question then comes down to who would fund that? And I think that's where that is the challenge, I suppose, that now faces the local authorities and Irish Water. One other key element of it, and this is what feeds into the next one, is the need for a single organisation with responsibility for water management and all those things at a catchment level. It's the successful regimes that we've seen in parts of Australia and in the US is where we have consistent legislative implementation and policies throughout a catchment across local authorities, with one overarching body that could be at government level, with responsibility, but that there is the capacity within the local authorities in terms of funding. They can generate their own income, and they have ways of doing that. So they're not just like we have here in Ireland, where local authorities are funded from central government, where there's strong local government that can generate their own revenue and implement their own policies supported by a national organisation. So there are certainly, with Irish Water, and we're all assuming that Irish Water is here to stay, in some shape or form. But if we think of really what Irish Water is essentially a means for generating revenue from European investment banks to invest in water infrastructure in Ireland. And and the charging model is the money that's collected is used to pay back those loans. But unless the charge is directly linked to the volume of water that's consumed or discharged, then there isn't really an incentive for the citizen to implement a SuDS retrofit scheme. So I think it's what other countries are doing is, yes, they charge for storm water, and there are other models that have been adopted, but generally speaking, for it to be successful, you need to be charging enough for the citizen to consider, well, okay, if I'm paying X in water charges, my rainwater harvesting system, my water charges will be, there'll be a payback period of 3 years, so it might make sense to have a rainwater harvesting system or to retrofit SuDS. But the current funding model as it is, for political reasons, doesn't really support that. So that's something that I suppose we should be mindful of. But the key issue then, it comes down to leadership and SuDS champions. Within the local authorities, there are people who are very enthusiastic about SuDS and who are driving the SuDS agenda. And I think everybody remembers Don McEntee back in 2005, who was really zealous about it and got everybody on board. And within the local authorities, there are people who are leading the charge. And I'm glad to see Joe. I hope you don't mind me mentioning it. Joe is here tonight, and he's certainly in Dún Laoghaire, who was really at the forefront of leading the SuDS agenda. But we need people within the local authorities and in professional practice who are going to be at the forefront of educating the general public, of guiding our clients to do the right thing, and making sure and advising central government that we need a broader approach in terms of legislation and governance structures to make sure that these things are a success. So looking at the legislative barriers, currently in Ireland, SuDS policy is there for new development. What other countries do is not only do they set discharge limits in terms of volumetric limits, in terms of attenuation to 2 litres a second or greenfield runoff rates, they also set treatment standards. So as a requirement of your planning, yes, okay, you need to restrict your discharge to X litres a second. Also, they will say, for example, I want so many milligrams a litre suspended solids, so many milligrams a litre of hydrocarbons. And the only way you can achieve the big menu that they give you is by actually designing and implementing a SuDS system on your site. Now that obviously then comes back to enforcement and resources in the local authorities to monitor that. But planning conditions are your planning conditions, they are a legal document. And as everybody knows, maybe some of you would know, when you go to sell your house, one of the first things that if you've built it yourself or done some modifications to it, you need to have, the person looking to buy your site will look at your planning conditions to check that you've actually that they're buying what they think they're buying. So that's one obvious difference between the requirements in Ireland and internationally. The local authority focus, and understandably so, is on compliance with current legislative requirements, and that's quite obvious, and the reasons for that are funding. So if something is law, then generally speaking, the local authority will get some funding from central government to make sure that they achieve compliance. But the fact is, there is no law currently. There is no legislation for SuDS. There is no legislation for surface water discharge to rivers. Surface water outfalls are generally not licensed at all. There is no monitoring and inspection regime. And another one, exempted developments. So what about, it's all very well and good, we have a policy for new developments that require planning, but if your development doesn't require planning permission, if you want to, you can build up to, I think, 40 square meters ground floor extension without looking for planning permission. And if you add up, you know, that 40 square meters throughout urban or suburban areas, that's an awful lot of runoff. And there is no incentive for the private citizen to implement SuDS as part of that at all. And the issue then, I suppose, of taking in charge is a big one. But certainly there is some movement in the right direction on that. The local authorities are more accepting of SuDS. It's really one of the biggest challenges. Again, I shouldn't be mentioning my roads colleagues, but roads engineers would be less open to SuDS than drainage engineers. Now, I would argue that I'm both a roads and a drainage engineer, so I'm doing the best I can, but certainly SuDS is being taken in charge by the local authorities. And we've seen, for example, some schemes we've done in Dublin City Centre where permeable paving used to be a big no-no. Now permeable paving is being taken in charge by local authorities. In Dún Laoghaire, the Parks Department are very progressive in their views towards SuDS in public open spaces. So things are certainly moving in the right direction. But the fact that there isn't a consistent approach between the local authorities is certainly an issue. So again, going back to the interviews and legislation. Legislation for SuDS is deemed throughout the local authorities as being fundamental in overcoming resistance from local government elected officials. Because again, getting back to the role of the engineer in society, by and large, developers and the corporate world have access to local government elected officials, as do we all. But they could be argued that in the absence of stronger governance processes and legislation, they probably have a bigger voice. One of the initiatives that was actually proposed by Dublin City Council a number of years ago was this idea of a SuDS matrix, in that in any new development of a particular type in the Dublin City Council's functional area, there would be a certain number of minimum points required as part of a planning application. So for example, the bigger the site, the more points you would need, so the more SuDS systems you would need, because it was quite apparent that, you know, up to particularly during the height of the boom, the burden was really greater on the smaller development or the individual, where if you were, for example, building a house extension greater than 40 square meters and you needed to apply for planning permission, you would still have your requirement to provide attenuation and SuDS. And the big developer might have a 5 hectare site and he would need to provide attenuation and maybe SuDS. And the SuDS feature may be 10 or 15 permeable paving parking spaces and an underground tank. So Dublin City Council, the Drainage Division, in consultation with the other local authority divisions, devised a point system to level the playing field and to provide consistency and to inform engineers and the general public as to what should be required. And that was to be adopted as part of the development plan, but it didn't get past the elected members because it was deemed to be a burden to development. So I suppose but things have, I think things have moved on in the interim. But that's just an example, and that's not so long ago of the challenges that are faced by engineers in the local authorities and engineers working for private clients. Now this is the good one. financial incentives to encourage the implementation of SuDS in new developments and SuDS retrofit. I suppose the natural follow-on to that is that you probably need to be paying something in the first instance anyway. How that would be implemented is really needs to be tackled at local government level and at central government level. So SuDS systems in new developments, yes, it is planning policy, but we've seen our own evidence and international evidence that suggests that really planning policy wording is enough, and that SuDS retrofit is really the key. So if we think again about urban settings that are largely served by combined sewer systems, there is certainly an opportunity there for Irish Water and for the local authorities to look at wider objectives and the wider agenda, not just combined sewer overflows and treatment plants, but if all of the benefits of SuDS could be considered from the local authority perspective and from Irish Water perspective, then there is certainly an opportunity there for some SuDS retrofit, and to ensure that SuDS is adopted in new developments. Now, it could be as simple as charging people for the volume of storm water or that they discharge, or it could be which would of course have its own licensing and monitoring challenges, or it could be something like they do in parts of Germany, where there's a local tax that every citizen has to pay, but in terms of your development levies, if you provide 100% green coverage, then you don't pay development levies. So if you put on a green roof, provide your permeable paving, put in your SuDS to certain standards, then there are offsets against your development levies, which is something that I think some local authorities are considering. But again, it comes back to SuDS retrofit. That needs to be, I suppose that is the key to this, because we've seen, for example, in the last number of years where we've gone through an economic recession, very little has been built, and there's been very few SuDS sites, if any, have been constructed. So there's a number of challenges and opportunities there that the engineer can play a pivotal role in. And then coming down to the local authorities, and this is the final slide. Resources in the local authority to monitor and developments is a key issue. I think we would all agree, in generally speaking, that self-certification in the absence of strong governance and legislation hasn't served us well. So certainly the local authorities need to be resourced adequately. The management train approach to SuDS is really something that only a few or enlightened individuals are aware of. So there is only so much in terms of, the focus has been traditionally on flooding, but of course, SuDS is really all about water treatment, and the management train approach to SuDS is fundamental. So it's the policies of getting a consistent SuDS system across a catchment and throughout catchments is the key, but people need to be aware of that, and the philosophy of that. And then coming down to a basic principle of asset management, I suppose you could say, local authorities have really no information. I know Dublin City Council was keeping a database, but there is very little information that the local authorities have in terms of establishing and finding out the location, condition and performance of what you might call SuDS features or tanks in their functional area. There is increasing pressure on local authorities now to take developments in charge. But the local authorities don't have a database of information, and they will be relying on information that's been provided by private developers or perhaps their agents. Something that needs to be addressed, and that needs resources. I touched earlier on about the I wouldn't say competing objectives, you might say, between some departments in the local authorities, between the roads departments and drainage divisions, and how they can be inadvertently circumvented in the planning process. That certainly needs to be addressed. But by and large, the local authorities are very well coordinated, and they all know what the various requirements are. But from my own experience, sometimes if you're working for a particular client who maybe in one individual department, could be in roads or it could be in housing, they may not necessarily be aware of SuDS or SuDS requirements or what a SuDS regime is. And we touched on a number of times greater resources, financial, organisational and technical, between between local authority departments and across local authorities. That's it. Thanks very much. An hour. Any questions, comments? It's thrown up more questions than answers, but generally speaking, those are the issues that are facing that are challenging us civil engineers in the implementation of SuDS and water management generally. So I'd look forward to. Yeah.
John, thanks for the presentation. You started the presentation by saying you don't see many SuDS features when you walk around the city.
Mm-hmm.
I work in building department, and one of the issues that I get is I get a lot of sort of like brownfield sites where you have a client will take almost the whole site area, site boundary, I mean, and then they have like a basement underneath there, or a double basement.
Mm.
How do you introduce SuDS features there? I mean, you can improve the water quality, but the quantity would be an issue.
Yeah, I think there is a huge benefit in brownfield sites. And when you say brownfield, I assume you mean a site that was previously developed and is now being redeveloped. So traditionally, older developments will be served by a combined sewer system. So the wastewater and the surface water goes into a single pipe into a public sewer, which is probably a sewer in an urban area. By the fact that you're actually putting in a new development in a brownfield site, there is a huge opportunity, because the first thing you're going to be doing is providing a separate system. So you're going to be separating the foul drainage from the surface water. And there are various requirements. The local authorities are quite prescriptive in terms of when you're developing a site and you're connecting to a combined sewer, the regime of how you bring the two pipes to your site boundary, connect, and how you have the interconnection between the two in the future. But I mean, site coverage is certainly an issue, but I mean, there's a whole range of things that you can do, and one of the things that we're developing in our office is our green roofs, which are great, and also blue roofs. And the distinction between those is, I suppose, your green roof will certainly provide some storage and attenuation, and for anything less than a 1 year event, or up to 1 year event, you might get no discharge at all. The challenge would be for greater rainfall events. If you have a green roof, how do you store the excess? But you can do an awful lot with landscaping, with rain gardens, with swales, basins, channels. In urban centres, it is more difficult because you've got a lot less room. But if you have permeable paving, if you have a green roof, you may need to, water butts, rain gardens. It is more challenging, but the opportunities are there to provide something that's very attractive and will give you enough storage. But the fact that it is a brownfield site actually brings benefits from the outset. But certainly it depends how much space you have available. It's very difficult in an urban centre to put in a basin or a pond. You may need some some underground storage. But certainly that should only be as a last resort. There's an awful lot you can do with green roofs, blue roofs, rain gardens to provide the storage, and water butts.
Like you said there, but the issue is...
And rainwater harvesting, I should say. Sorry.
You can't get much of infiltration if you have like a site that's covering the site boundary and you have a basement underneath. I mean, you will have storage automatic to the permeable, to the coarse material.
Yeah.
I suppose I brought that up because we get a lot of clients who actually are pursuing LEED or rehab.
Yeah.
And then there is a requirement to reduce your runoff volume.
Yeah.
I mean, you can improve the water, you can use all these sorts, permeable paving, green roofs, but the water quantity would still be the same.
Well, in terms of quantity, what you're looking at then are things like modified planters or the bioretention areas that I showed earlier on, or green roofs. So you're relying on, to some degree, evapotranspiration. So that's how a green roof works, essentially. The challenge then is in the excess. So where does the excess go? Or how do you store the excess?
You don't get much sun either, so it's very hard to gauge how much you're taking on soil without transpiration.
Yeah, but there are ways of calculating that. That can be calculated. One thing as well we're looking at is blue roofs, where essentially, the technology is now has been developed in the UK, and something that we're looking at in some detail, where you can provide a green roof to more or less any pitch of a roof that you have with a particular geosynthetic. Blue roofs are a different philosophy. There's something that structural engineers get very annoyed about, but essentially you store the 1 in 100-year rainfall depth on the roof of your building. So yeah, that's it's something that they're doing in the UK, and there's a few people smiling here. Yeah, we've looked at some of those. So that technology is there, and it's been developed in the UK. But where you're looking at brownfield sites, it really depends on your site coverage. But even on a confined site, if you have green roofs, rain gardens, bioretention areas, modified planters, you certainly will get a reduction in your surface water volume. The question is, it's all to do with the excess. But it is possible to design all of those, Joe.
You mentioned blue roofs there. Are you designing any at the moment?
It's something that we're looking at with the company in the UK that have done quite a few pilot studies, and they're involved in a pretty big hospital site in Liverpool. I can talk to you about that afterwards, actually. But essentially, they're a geosynthetic specialist, so they actually manufacture linings for traditionally landfills, right? And where you would have particular slopes, you need to make sure that this geosynthetic won't slide and won't slip and can do what it needs to do in terms of conveying leachate. And it's a similar system has been developed for a roofing system. So essentially it just looks like your egg carton, except it's a particular plastic, and it's quite simple to design or calculate what your 1 in 100-year depth 6-hour event is, and you store that depth of water on your roof. The challenge then is making sure it discharges in a controlled fashion. But the technology is there, and this is something that's been done in the UK and abroad for quite some time. Hi.
Hi, Anthony McCloy, Consulting.
How are you doing, Master?
Yeah, now I have a couple of points and then a question, if you don't mind. I suppose the first point to make, I like the fact that you picked up in this management training. I think a lot of the career examples of where subsequently applied is where they missed the point of the management training.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's about very much more than just treatment. It's about appreciating the wider benefits in terms of flood resilience. The fact is you have more than one mode of failure before the whole system collapses. It's about biodiversity, it's about protecting everything on site. So if there was a way of prescribing through legislation and policy about an implementation of treatment or management training as part of SuDS, so you haven't got SuDS unless you've got management training, unless you've got source control, I think that would move things forward dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually think storage of water on
It'll be gone eventually. It's just about putting in enough concrete and steel to hold it up for a few hours.
At the end of it, we design for snow loading, we design for wind loading. We're talking about 50 mil water potentially around that ballpark.
Agreed. You're preaching to the converted on this one, but you'd be you'd be amazed.
Yeah, I suppose the other point then was around SuDS in town and city centres, particularly where we have combined systems.
Mm.
The talk about separation, I agree with, but if you're in a district or an area that's served solely by a combined system,
Mm-hmm.
and you have no nearby water courses or culverts,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to end up going to the culvert in any case because
Mhm.
you have no other option.
Mm-hmm.
So, I suppose for me it raises a couple of interesting questions.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, how much treatment do you actually need? Because if it's going to the combined sewer anyway,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to get the works. So,
Mm-hmm.
where do you set the priorities?
Mhm.
Is it more about controlling not the 1 in 100, the 1 in 1,
Mhm.
2,
Mhm.
the things that really are detrimental in terms of CSO spill?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose, if you can give your viewpoint on that in terms of where you think it should go or how you
Mhm.
think it should be reset in terms of priorities.
Sure. Yeah.
And the actual question, this one you didn't pick up on, is really the role of the client and the role of the professional and procurement in particular. If we have procurement which is driven on price, I've sat with local authorities in England. I've worked in England for the last 10 years, specialised in SuDS, and we moved to up saying we can get the price of SuDS design for the same price as a conventional drainage design. You know full well they're not getting SuDS design. They're getting a pipe drainage design with a pond and tank or basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you change? Well, first of all, you haven't identified that as buyer. Do you see that procurement model as a buyer to SuDS, and how do you change that?
Yeah. Okay. Just I suppose. Come on. So in terms of the procurement, are you talking about if it's a public body or a private individual?
Either or.
Yeah. I suppose it comes down to policies. If there is particularly strong local authority policies, like we've seen they have in the UK and parts of Australia and the US, where people are actually incentivised to implement SuDS, such as the example I gave where your development levies are linked to the percentage coverage of green on your site, well then it's a no-brainer. There is very little, you wouldn't necessarily need a pipe in that instance. So it comes down to policies there. So I can come back to that. But touching on the brownfield sites, I suppose where brownfield sites have a huge opportunity is that traditionally you would have had a site that was developed in the past, a conventional drainage system, no SuDS or attenuation, discharging to a combined sewer. The fact that you're providing attenuation now on this site, okay, without looking at the wider catchment, you're effectively adding capacity to the public sewer network in the first place by providing attenuation alone. Now you want to do more than that. The interesting thing that you mentioned about the quality, and yeah, you're right in that we tend to be hung up on this 1 in 100 year. And again, SuDS, there's an awful lot more to SuDS than flooding and flood mitigation. And I think in Ireland and the UK, we still have this quantity, quality, biodiversity thing. And of course, that is fundamental to SuDS, but there are much wider benefits that are accepted. But it's very interesting if you talk to some people in the lab in Dublin City Centre, for example, or in the EPA. What they've actually found is that when they take some samples of water, hydrocarbons are as big an issue, if not bigger, than BOD from combined sewers. So anything we can do to help our streams and rivers, we should do that. And brownfield sites are a no-brainer because from a planning perspective and from a sustainability perspective, they're a winner. So I think that answers the first question. Getting back to procurement, yeah, okay, if it's a simple choice, there was the perception up until recently that SuDS is more expensive, because what people thought of was, well, okay, I used to put in one pipe that took everything. Now I'm putting in 2 pipes and a tank. That's more expensive than the 1 pipe, but that's not SuDS either. So our thinking has kind of evolved somewhat. Pipes aren't SuDS. Oversized pipes isn't SuDS. So SuDS. There is no doubt. We're all civil engineers and we're reasonably level-headed people. If you're digging something that's deep, well, that costs more than putting in something that's shallow, right? So keeping water at the surface, dig less, put in less stuff, will be cheaper. Now, if it's a case of I've got option A and option B and at the same price, and I'm familiar with pipes, and I'm familiar with certain SuDS features, and I've done it before, well, then the tendency can be to revert back. But if there are these policies that we know that Dunleary are looking at that have been successful in other jurisdictions, where for new developments you simply just look at your development levies. Now, you're probably paying taxes in other areas, but there's certainly an incentive there, and it's recognised because they have the benefit of looking at the water cycle, and you have usually a single body with responsibility for water supply, water and wastewater. A very simple one is this idea of site coverage, and the more green you have, the less you pay. The SuDS matrix was an example of that, although there wasn't a financial incentive associated with it, but it was to be a minimum requirement for developments of a particular size, of a particular type in the local authority, but it didn't get past elected members. But interestingly, lots of local authorities at pre-planning discussions will produce the SuDS matrix and say, I would like you to do this. Now, sometimes a private client, the first thing they will say is, look, if it's not written down somewhere and if it's not the law, then I don't want to do it. Well, actually, if it saves them money, they will do it. And that's where the enlightened engineer comes in, and that's where we need to take a leadership role. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned that Dublin City Council are now willing to take, permanent payment in charge, and Dunleary Down County Council are willing to take in charge what's your feel for the, councils outside of Dublin, they're operating to take in charge SuDS features?
I mean,
permeable paving or, swales, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. But I think I mentioned about the partite process being a particular, can be a particular barrier to SuDS. But what we've often found is that it's actually local authority developments where you have SuDS champions or enlightened people involved. They're really the ones where new ground is broken. So the permeable paving example I gave in Dublin City Council, that was actually a scheme that we were doing as part of the Ballymun regeneration scheme, and it was a local authority scheme. And okay, initially there was some reticence and there was some concerns about permeable paving, largely because of bad experiences. That the local authority would have been called into a private site, it could be a car park in a supermarket, and somebody would be saying to a local councillor or to somebody in the local authority, I parked my car here and I hit a pothole and look at the whole thing, the coming up. So, but that's really a design issue and a construction issue. But I suppose with time, it is certainly the fact that people are more, there is more experience of this. Now it has been around for a bit longer, although not a whole lot has been built in the last number of years. But I think people are moving in the right direction. But that's where you, the engineer, have a role to play.
A recent example, without naming a particular local authority, but there was, even the mention of permeable paving and taking charge just is necessarily a conflict between roads engineers and drainage engineers, maybe that's part of it too, but yeah, very reluctant to consider.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I suppose the challenge there is to try and figure out why that would be the case, and there are obvious reasons for it. So if there are particular ground conditions, well, then your permeable paving may have to be designed a certain way. You may need to introduce geogrids for structural stability. I mean, we've put in permeable paving in car parks in hospitals that were old quarry sites, and there's about 3 meters of fill underneath these car parks. But with the right design, they've been built now for 6 or 7 years, and there's no problem. So it's a matter of understanding why it is an issue, that there are reasons for it. They're not necessarily being unreasonable, they're just, I suppose, basing their views on their own experiences. And if you can show them some good examples, even in more extreme circumstances, then there's no reason why it won't happen. But these things, SuDS is a new philosophy. It used to be, get the water underground, get it away as quickly as possible, and pipe it to the nearest stream or river as quickly as possible so that we don't flood and don't mind the guy downstream. SuDS is completely different. We're saying hold on to it for as long as you can, and keep it as close to surface as you can for as long as you can. I mean, I was over, we're doing quite a few research projects that are EU funded in this area and in climate change in general. And I was over in Holland a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the Dutch have been keeping the sea out for a few hundred years, and it's amazing what they're doing over there. But the first thing that struck me is when you fly over Holland in a plane and you look down, there's water everywhere, and and the more water you see, the more salubrious the estate is. They don't. We have this, I suppose, and it's ironic, being that we are Irish and it rains a lot, but we have a certain fear of open channels and all that goes with that. But I was chatting to one guy over there, and he said, well, look, in Holland we teach our kids to swim more or less as soon as they can walk. So they accept that there will be channels running through your housing estates, that your school will probably be surrounded by some sort of a moat, and they don't mind that.
That was another example that could have been, the idea of having a wetland, which obviously be an attenuation or a thing in the future. But
Yeah.
you tend to get that response, what if someone falls in it?
Yeah. Well, again, that is understandable, but that can be overcome with good design. If you have shallow ponds, shallow wetlands, nice gentle side slopes, don't put in fences, because kids are very good at climbing fences, and adults aren't as good at climbing fences. So normally a child will get in, but daddy won't. But again, it comes down to design, Yeah.
I had one more question, just now it comes to mind. I suppose it sort of harks back to experience in GD. I think we're
Experience in what, sorry?
in Great Britain.
Yeah.
It's very segmented. It's certainly not the utopia that it might appear to be. There's a long way to go, and it's the same old issues of adoption.
Yes.
Who's going to maintain?
Fragmented responsibilities. Yeah.
The usual myth or dispersion in terms of it can't be this public space site. It's the same line
Yeah.
as used.
Yeah.
But there are a few exemplars in terms of sites and projects that local authorities and those in government can make a decision, can point to and say, well, there's a demonstration of how it has been achieved and how well it's been done.
Yeah.
What sites would you say would be of a similar help in terms of
Yeah. I mean, one of the, that was one of the questions that I raised in the interview process, and I suppose there was you know, the answers were interesting, but at the same time understandable. The GDSDS was published in 2005, was adopted more or less straight away by the local authorities, and it's all about new developments. So in 2007, we know what happened. So when you speak to the various local authority people and personnel, there are very few examples of sites. There are fewer examples still of where the management train is in place, where you have something on a site and something elsewhere downstream in the catchment. But I suppose there are a few examples that are still cited. City West is one that the local authorities would mention. Now, I think in there's a lot that's right about it, and it certainly was ahead of its time. But you know, there are certain things about it that could be improved, but it was certainly, as I said, ahead of its time when it was built. What Dunleary are doing is very progressive in actually using public parks where there's streams going through public parks. They're actually doing some really attractive stuff. Now, from the international perspective, that would be viewed as being an end of pipe type solution, and is limited in terms of the treatment it provides. It certainly will provide some, and it's an awful lot better than what was there before. But I suppose the key is to get the site controls in, and to have the policies to promote individuals that are outside the planning process to put in some source control. So what Dunleary are doing is, you know, and that isn't necessarily linked to new developments, although maybe indirectly. But so, you know, there are, you know, you can possibly, you know, that there are some sites where we've put in, like I said, impermeable paving in Ballymun. There are some open spaces that are used there for flooding. Again, they wouldn't tick all of the boxes, but there are certainly quite a lot of SuDS features. As part of motorway schemes, infrastructure projects, again, they have their, they probably wouldn't go as far as some of us would like, but you know, there are examples of ponds and wetlands in various motorway motorway schemes. We're involved in a number of motorway service areas in Northern Ireland, and we've built a couple here in Ireland, and there are some nice features in those. But I would find it hard to mention a classic SuDS site where we have everything going on within a development and somewhere downstream that would tick all of the boxes. I think there are a whole plethora of individual sites that would have some site source control and some storage. But it depends. Yeah. Well, I mean, you wouldn't want to be relying on it, but you know, the philosophy of SuDS, certainly, there are benefits to regional controls, but that's mainly qualitative.